Before this story begins, I want to ask you something. How many families survive by staying silent? How many betrayals are hidden behind the word loyalty? If you've ever felt trapped between truth and belonging, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us until the end, because this isn't just a story about one family. It's about the choices we inherit, the pain we carry, and what happens when loyalty is written in blood. It never begins with a scream. That is the lie people tell themselves when they imagine family fractures. They picture slammed doors, raised voices, broken objects scattered across a living room floor. But the truth is far quieter and far more dangerous. Forgiveness doesn't die in an explosion. It suffocates slowly in the absence of truth, in the weight of what is never said. In our family, the moment forgiveness died was not announced. No one marked it with a date or a memory sharp enough to point to later. It happened in a pause, in a look that lingered too long, in a silence that suddenly became permanent. There was a time before the fracture, though even that feels uncertain now. Memory reshapes itself when pain becomes its editor. We remember warmth because we need to believe it existed. We remember laughter because the alternative is too heavy. But beneath those memories, something had already been forming, something fragile and unstable, waiting for pressure. The event itself, the one people always ask about, did not feel dramatic when it occurred. That's what makes it so difficult to explain. It was not a single act of cruelty that shattered everything, but a moment of realization, the understanding that what had happened would never be acknowledged in the way it needed to be. Forgiveness requires a bridge, an admission, a recognition that harm occurred. In our family, that bridge was never built. Instead, there was avoidance. Conversations shifted mid-sentence. Names were no longer spoken in certain rooms. Stories were retold with details carefully removed, like evidence erased from a crime scene. At first, it felt temporary. Families tell themselves that time will soften edges, that silence is a cooling-off period. But silence has a way of hardening into policy. Before we understood what was happening, not forgiving had become the only honest position left. What broke us was not just what happened, but how it was handled afterward. The refusal to name it, the expectation that endurance would replace accountability. Forgiveness was implied, demanded even, but never earned. And that distinction matters, because forgiveness, when forced, stops being healing and starts becoming another form of violence. In our family, the unspoken message was clear. Peace mattered more than truth. Stability mattered more than pain, and those who could not accept that bargain became the problem. There is a particular cruelty in watching people you love pretend nothing happened. It creates a split inside you. On one side, the desire to belong, to keep the family intact, to avoid becoming the source of discomfort. On the other, the reality of what you experienced, what you witnessed, what you cannot unsee. That split is where forgiveness went to die, because forgiving would have meant choosing the comfort of others over the integrity of your own memory. It would have meant agreeing to a lie simply to keep the table full at family gatherings. As time passed, the fracture stopped being about the original event and started being about the response to it. That is something people outside rarely understand. They ask, why couldn't you just forgive? As if forgiveness is a button you press, a decision you make in isolation. But forgiveness does not exist without truth. And truth was the one thing our family could not tolerate. The cost of honesty was too high. It threatened reputations, hierarchies, and identities that had been carefully constructed over years. Slowly, the family reorganized itself around the silence. Roles shifted. Some became protectors of the narrative, defenders of the unspoken agreement. Others withdrew, learning that presence required compliance. And a few, often the ones most affected, became inconvenient reminders of what everyone else was trying to forget. Forgiveness was framed as maturity, as strength, as the moral high ground. Refusal was painted as bitterness, as weakness, as an inability to move on. But that framing ignored a fundamental truth. Moving on from something that has never been acknowledged is not growth, it is erasure. The moment forgiveness truly died was not when the harm occurred, but when it became clear that it would never be addressed. When apologies were replaced with excuses, when concern was replaced with irritation, when pain was met not with care, but with impatience. At that point, forgiveness stopped being an option and became a betrayal of self. It would have required pretending that what happened was acceptable, or at least forgettable. And some things cannot be forgotten without losing something essential. From the outside, the family still looked intact. Holidays happened. Photos were taken. Smiles appeared on command. But inside, there was a permanent tension, a low-frequency hum of unresolved grief. Conversations stayed shallow. Emotional honesty became dangerous. The family learned to function without forgiveness by replacing it with routine. Routine is efficient. It allows people to coexist without confronting anything real, but it also ensures that nothing ever heals. People often assume that refusing to forgive is an act of anger. In our case, it was an act of clarity. Anger fades. Clarity does not. It was the understanding that forgiveness would not fix what was broken, because the break was never acknowledged. The refusal to forgive was not about punishment. It was about refusal to participate in a shared illusion. It was about drawing a line where none had existed before and saying, quietly but firmly, this is where denial ends. Over time, that choice reshaped everything. Relationships became conditional. Trust eroded in subtle ways. Love remained, but it was cautious, guarded, incomplete. The family did not explode, it calcified. And at the center of that calcification was the unspoken knowledge that forgiveness was off the table, not because we lacked compassion, but because compassion without truth is hollow. This is where the story truly begins, not with the act itself, but with the moment everyone realized that forgiveness would never come, that it could not come, because to forgive would have required something the family was unwilling to give: honesty. And once that realization settled in, loyalty began to shift, silence became law, and the consequences started to ripple outward in ways no one could fully control. Loyalty is one of the most celebrated virtues inside a family. It is praised, expected, and often demanded without question. From an early age, we are taught that loyalty means standing by one another no matter what, protecting the family name, keeping problems inside the house. In healthy families, loyalty can mean support, solidarity, and care. In ours, loyalty slowly transformed into something else entirely. It became a weapon, sharpened by fear, and wielded against anyone who threatened the fragile peace built on silence. After forgiveness disappeared, loyalty rushed in to fill the void. It offered clarity where uncertainty had lived before. You were either with the family or against it. Either you protected the narrative, or you became a liability. There was no room for nuance, no space for conflicting truths. Loyalty stopped being about love and became about allegiance. And allegiance, once enforced, does not tolerate doubt. The shift was subtle at first. No one announced new rules, but everyone seemed to understand them instinctively. Certain questions were no longer welcome. Certain emotions were considered inappropriate. Expressions of pain were met with discomfort, followed quickly by reminders of unity, resilience, and the importance of not tearing the family apart. Loyalty was framed as maturity. Silence was framed as strength. And those who struggled with that silence were quietly repositioned as the problem. What made loyalty so powerful was how moral it sounded. Who wants to be accused of disloyalty to their own family? The word itself carries shame. It implies betrayal, selfishness, weakness. And so, Loyalty became the language through which control was exercised. When someone raised concerns, they were told they were being divisive. When someone expressed hurt, they were accused of holding grudges. When someone refused to move on, they were reminded of everything the family had done for them. Loyalty was no longer about standing by one another. It was about protecting certain people from accountability. Inside this system, forgiveness was no longer a personal choice. It became a test of allegiance. To forgive meant you were loyal. To refuse meant you were dangerous. The family did not need to punish anyone openly. Loyalty did that work on its own. People adjusted their behavior to avoid conflict, to avoid exclusion, to avoid being seen as the one who disrupted the illusion of harmony. Over time, loyalty did what force never could. It trained everyone to self-censor. There is a particular kind of fear that emerges in these environments. Not the fear of being harmed, but the fear of being isolated. Humans are social creatures, and families are our first and most powerful social structures. To risk exclusion is to risk losing identity, history, belonging. Loyalty exploited that fear. It whispered that survival depended on compliance, that questioning the wrong person could cost you everything. That truth was less important than togetherness. As the family reorganized around loyalty, relationships changed shape. Conversations became strategic rather than honest. People learned who could be trusted with certain thoughts and who could not. Emotional intimacy was replaced with performative closeness. On the surface, everything looked functional. Underneath, everyone was calculating. Loyalty demands vigilance. It requires constant proof, and the burden of that proof always falls heaviest on those who already feel wounded. For those who could not accept this version of loyalty, the cost was immediate and profound. They were labeled difficult, dramatic, or incapable of letting go. Their pain was reframed as obsession. Their refusal to forgive was treated as a character flaw, rather than a response to unresolved harm. Slowly, they found themselves on the margins of family life, not expelled outright, but subtly distanced. Invitations became conditional. Support became inconsistent. Affection became cautious. What loyalty erased most effectively was complexity. It flattened the story into something manageable, good intentions, unfortunate misunderstandings, everyone doing their best. There was no room for the reality that someone could be loved and still cause deep harm. No room for the idea that protecting the family might sometimes mean confronting uncomfortable truths. Loyalty preferred simplicity, even if that simplicity was false. As time went on, loyalty stopped being something people chose and became something they performed. It showed up in rehearsed phrases, in forced optimism, in the way difficult topics were redirected with humor or irritation. The family became skilled at maintaining appearances. Outsiders admired how close everyone seemed. They mistook endurance for healing. They praised the family's ability to stick together. What they did not see was the emotional cost of that togetherness. Inside, resentment grew quietly, not always toward the person who caused the original harm, but toward the system that demanded silence in the name of loyalty. People felt trapped between their own experiences and the expectations placed upon them. Over time, that tension turned inward. Anxiety, guilt, and self-doubt flourished. Loyalty, once internalized, becomes self-policing. You begin to question your own memories, your own reactions. You wonder if you are overreacting, if you are being unfair, if your pain is somehow unreasonable. This is how loyalty becomes dangerous. It does not need to deny reality outright. It simply reframes it. It suggests that maintaining the family unit is more important than addressing harm. That discomfort is a sign of weakness, that forgiveness is owed, not earned. In doing so, loyalty ensures that nothing truly changes. The family survives, but at the cost of honesty. Peace is preserved, but only on the surface. By the time loyalty had fully taken hold, forgiveness was no longer even discussed. It was assumed, expected, and its absence was treated as defiance. The choice was no longer between forgiving or not forgiving. The choice was between belonging and integrity. Many chose belonging not because they agreed with the narrative, but because the alternative felt unbearable. Others chose integrity, knowing it would come at a price. This is where the story deepens, because once loyalty replaces truth, silence becomes law. And the family, having chosen survival over honesty, begins to enforce that law without ever acknowledging it exists. Silence does not arrive as an accident. It is built, reinforced, and eventually enforced. By the time our family reached this stage, silence was no longer just a reaction to discomfort. It had become the law that governed everything. No one announced it, no one voted on it, and yet everyone understood its boundaries, what could be said, what must never be mentioned, which memories were acceptable and which were dangerous. Silence stopped being the absence of sound and became a system of control. At first, silence was framed as kindness. Let's not reopen old wounds. There's no point in talking about it anymore. We've all moved on. These phrases were repeated so often that they began to sound reasonable, compassionate even, but underneath them was an unspoken truth. Talking about what happened would require acknowledging things the family was not prepared to face. Silence offered a solution, not a healthy one, but an efficient one. It allowed life to continue without disruption. It preserved appearances. It protected people who did not want to answer questions. As loyalty took hold, silence became its natural extension. Loyalty demanded protection, and silence provided it. Together, they formed a closed loop. You proved loyalty by staying silent. You maintained silence by being loyal. Anyone who broke that loop threatened the stability of the entire structure, and so silence stopped being optional. It became expected behavior. The rules of this silence were never written, but they were precise. You could speak in generalities, but never specifics. You could acknowledge tension, but not its source. You could express sadness, but not anger. Anger implied injustice, and injustice implied responsibility. Responsibility was the one thing silence was designed to erase. Over time, even emotions were regulated. Certain feelings were acceptable, others were quietly discouraged. Pain was tolerated only if it was vague enough to be harmless. What made silence so powerful was how ordinary it felt. It hid itself inside politeness, routine, and tradition. Family gatherings continued. Celebrations happened on schedule. Stories were told and retold, edited just enough to remove anything that might lead to questions. Silence did not isolate people physically, it isolated them emotionally. Everyone was present, but no one was fully known. The family existed in parallel realities, each person carrying their own version of the truth, careful never to let it collide with someone else's. For those who remembered too clearly, silence was suffocating. It demanded a constant act of self-erasure. You learned to swallow words before they reached your mouth. You rehearsed neutral responses in advance. You monitored your expressions, your tone, your posture. Silence required performance, and performance, sustained over time, becomes exhaustion. But breaking silence carried consequences that felt even heavier. When someone did speak, even cautiously, the response was swift and instructive, not always confrontational, but corrective. A change in subject, a forced laugh, a reminder that this isn't the time. If that didn't work, the tone shifted. You were accused of being negative, of dwelling on the past, of creating unnecessary drama. Silence defended itself by reframing speech as aggression. Talking became the problem, not what was being talked about. This is how silence polices behavior without ever raising its voice. It relies on social cues, on discomfort, on the fear of being seen as difficult. Over time, people internalize those cues. They stop needing to be corrected. They correct themselves. Silence becomes automatic. You no longer think about whether you are allowed to speak. You simply don't. The absence of dialogue starts to feel normal, even inevitable. Inside this environment, forgiveness took on a distorted meaning. Forgiveness was no longer something that followed truth and accountability. It became synonymous with silence. To forgive meant to stop talking. To move on meant to forget. And forgetting was framed as growth. But forgetting in this context was not healing. It was compliance. It required pretending that the absence of discussion meant the absence of harm. The most damaging effect of silence was how it altered relationships. Conversations stayed shallow, careful, transactional. People learned to connect without touching anything real. Emotional closeness was replaced with familiarity. You knew each other's routines, preferences, histories, but not their inner lives. Silence creates proximity without intimacy. It allows people to coexist while remaining fundamentally alone. Over time, silence also reshaped memory itself. When stories are not told, they begin to blur. When experiences are not validated, they start to feel unreal. People who were hurt began to doubt their own perceptions. They wondered if they had imagined the severity of what happened. They questioned whether their reactions were exaggerated. Silence gaslights not through lies, but through omission. It makes reality feel unstable. The family, meanwhile, took pride in its resilience. Outsiders admired how everyone stayed together despite challenges. Silence was mistaken for strength. Endurance was mistaken for healing. No one saw the cost. No one noticed how conversations avoided certain names, how laughter came too quickly, how tension lingered beneath even the most ordinary moments. Silence does not announce itself. It hides in plain sight. As years passed, silence hardened. What began as avoidance turned into tradition. Younger generations absorbed it without knowing its origin. They learned what topics were off-limits before they ever understood why. Silence became inherited, passed down like an unspoken rulebook. Children sensed it intuitively. They noticed which questions made adults uncomfortable. They learned early that curiosity had limits. This is where silence becomes most dangerous, when it no longer feels like a choice, when it feels like the natural order of things. By the time anyone thought to challenge it, silence had already done its work. It had protected certain people, erased certain truths, and reshaped the family's emotional landscape. Breaking it would not just reopen old wounds, it would threaten the entire identity the family had built around survival. And so, silence remained. Not because everyone agreed with it, but because it felt safer than the alternative. Speaking meant disruption. Speaking meant loss. Silence promised continuity, even if that continuity was hollow. The family chose the comfort of the familiar over the risk of honesty. And in doing so, it ensured that the original wound would never heal, only be buried deeper with each passing year. This is the world the children grew up in. A world where something terrible had happened, but no one would name it. A world where silence was not just expected, but inherited, and the cost of that inheritance would not reveal itself until much later. Children are often described as resilient, but resilience is frequently misunderstood. It is not immunity, it is adaptation. And adaptation, when it happens in the presence of unresolved trauma, comes at a cost. By the time the children in our family were old enough to notice that something was wrong, silence had already shaped the environment they were growing up in. They did not witness the original fracture, but they lived inside its consequences. The wound had been sealed over, but it was never cleaned, and infections spread quietly. They sensed it first in small, confusing ways. A sudden change in tone when certain names were mentioned. A question that caused a room to stiffen. A story that stopped abruptly, as if someone had crossed an invisible line. Children are extraordinarily perceptive. They read emotional temperature before they understand language. They knew long before they could articulate it that curiosity had boundaries, that some truths were dangerous, that asking the wrong question could make adults uncomfortable, distant, or cold. In that environment, children learned to scan rooms before they spoke. They learned to measure reactions. They learned that love was conditional on emotional compliance. No one told them this directly. It was absorbed through repetition, through patterns, through the subtle ways attention was withdrawn when they expressed the wrong feeling. Over time, this conditioning became internal. They stopped needing correction. They corrected themselves. What children inherit in these families is not the event itself, but the emotional aftermath. They inherit tension without context, anxiety without explanation, loyalty without understanding. They feel the weight of something they did not cause and cannot name. This creates confusion at a fundamental level. When pain exists without a story, the mind fills in the gaps. Often, it fills them with self-blame. Many of the children grew up believing that discomfort was their fault. If a room felt tense, they assumed they had done something wrong. If adults seemed distant, they believed they were being difficult or demanding. Silence taught them that emotions should be minimized, hidden, or translated into something more acceptable. Sadness could become humor, fear could become obedience, anger, most dangerously, disappeared entirely. This is how trauma is passed down without ever being discussed. It does not need words, it lives in behavior, in parenting styles shaped by unresolved pain, in emotional reactions that feel disproportionate but never get examined. The children learned early that safety depended on keeping things smooth. They became mediators, peacekeepers, emotional caretakers. They took responsibility for harmony long before they were equipped to understand what harmony even meant. As they grew older, the effects deepened. Some struggled with anxiety that seemed to come from nowhere. Others developed a constant sense of vigilance, always waiting for something to go wrong. Relationships outside the family became complicated. Trust felt risky. Conflict felt catastrophic. They had learned at home that disagreement led to withdrawal, silence, and emotional distance, so they avoided it at all costs. For some, loyalty became their identity. They defended the family fiercely, even when they didn't fully understand what they were defending. Questioning felt disloyal. Doubt felt dangerous. They absorbed the same moral language they had grown up hearing. Forgiveness equals strength, silence equals maturity, endurance equals love. These beliefs shaped their choices, often without their awareness. Others reacted differently. They felt the injustice of the silence, even if they could not articulate it. They sensed that something important was missing, something unresolved. These children often became restless, angry, or withdrawn. Their behavior was labeled as difficult, rebellious, or overly sensitive. What was rarely acknowledged was that they were responding to an environment that demanded emotional suppression while denying emotional clarity. The absence of truth left them without a narrative to make sense of their experiences. Without context, pain feels random, and random pain is terrifying. It teaches children that the world is unpredictable, that security can vanish without explanation. This belief does not stay confined to childhood. It follows them into adulthood, shaping how they love, how they argue, how they leave. As adults, many of them struggled to identify their own needs. Having grown up prioritizing emotional stability for others, they had learned to ignore their internal signals. They felt guilty for wanting more honesty, more depth, more accountability. They questioned whether their expectations were unreasonable. Silence had taught them to doubt themselves. The most painful inheritance, however, was the belief that love requires self-erasure, that to belong, you must not ask for too much, that your pain is acceptable only if it does not inconvenience others. This belief quietly sabotaged relationships. It led to patterns of overgiving, under-asking, and chronic dissatisfaction. It attracted partners who benefited from emotional imbalance. It reinforced the idea that suffering is simply part of connection. Some of the children eventually tried to break the cycle. They asked questions, they sought therapy, they attempted difficult conversations, and when they did, they encountered the same resistance that had shaped their childhood. Silence closed ranks. Loyalty reasserted itself. They were reminded, subtly or directly, that revisiting the past was harmful, unnecessary, even cruel. The message was clear. The family had survived. Why couldn't they just be grateful? This confrontation was often the moment when the inherited wound fully revealed itself. The realization that the silence they grew up with was not accidental, that it was chosen, maintained, protected, and that challenging it would come at a cost. Some paid that cost and stepped away. Others stayed, carrying the weight quietly. Either way, the inheritance could no longer be ignored. The children paid the price for a decision they never made, a decision to prioritize stability over truth, to protect the system rather than heal the wound. Their struggles were not personal failures, but predictable outcomes of an environment shaped by unresolved trauma. Once this becomes clear, something shifts. The shame lifts. The confusion finds a name. The story begins to make sense, but understanding does not automatically bring closure. In fact, it often raises a more unsettling question. If forgiveness was never offered and silence was enforced, what happens next? Is healing possible without rewriting the past? Or does the refusal to forgive become its own kind of inheritance? Those questions lead directly into the next chapter of the story, because eventually, every family built on silence must confront the myth of closure. Closure is one of the most comforting myths we tell ourselves. It promises an ending, a moment when pain resolves neatly, when forgiveness closes the door on suffering and life resumes with clarity. It is a story people like to believe because it suggests that emotional wounds obey structure, that grief follows rules, that if you do the right things in the right order, healing will arrive on schedule. But for families like ours, closure was never real. It was an idea imposed from the outside, a demand disguised as wisdom. As the years passed, the pressure to find closure grew louder. It came from well-meaning friends, distant relatives, and even professionals who believed that forgiveness was the final step in recovery. They spoke of moving on, of letting go, of freeing ourselves from the past. What they did not understand was that closure assumes something essential has already happened. It assumes that truth has been acknowledged, that responsibility has been faced, that pain has been witnessed. None of that existed in our family. Closure was being asked of people who had never been allowed to speak. In this context, forgiveness was presented as the solution to everything. Forgive, and the family could finally heal. Forgive, and the tension would dissolve. Forgive, and everyone could be at peace. But this version of forgiveness was transactional. It required silence in exchange for belonging. It required emotional amnesty without justice. It asked the injured to do all the work so the system could remain unchanged. The lie of closure is that it treats forgiveness as an ending rather than a process. It suggests that once you forgive, the story is over. But stories do not end simply because one chapter is skipped. What is unresolved does not disappear. It goes underground. It reshapes itself. It finds expression in anxiety, resentment, distance, and repetition. Closure, when forced, does not heal. It seals the wound before it has been cleaned. In our family, calls for closure often carried an undercurrent of impatience. There was a sense that enough time had passed, that continued pain was a failure of character rather than a sign of unresolved harm. The responsibility shifted quietly. The question was no longer, "What happened?" but "Why can't you get over it?" Pain became an inconvenience. Memory became a liability. Those who still felt hurt were framed as obstacles to peace. This reframing was particularly damaging because it inverted moral responsibility. The original harm faded into abstraction, while the refusal to forgive became the central offense. Silence had already erased much of the story. Now, closure threatened to erase the rest. To forgive, in this context, would have meant agreeing that the harm no longer mattered, that the lack of accountability was acceptable. that the emotional cost borne by the most vulnerable members of the family was simply collateral damage. For some, the promise of closure was tempting. Who wouldn't want relief? Who wouldn't want an end to tension, to awkward gatherings, to the quiet grief that followed every interaction? But those who considered forgiveness seriously found themselves confronting an uncomfortable truth. Forgiveness would not bring closure because there was nothing to close. The wound was still open beneath the surface. Forgiving without truth would not resolve it. It would only make it invisible. There is also a deeper cruelty embedded in the myth of closure. It assumes that all pain should resolve in the same way, that healing has a universal shape, that refusing to forgive is evidence of emotional immaturity. But some wounds do not close neatly. Some losses cannot be integrated without fundamentally changing how we understand the people who cause them. In our family, forgiveness would have required rewriting reality. It would have required minimizing harm, excusing behavior, and invalidating lived experience. Instead of closure, what emerged was something far more complex: acceptance without forgiveness. Acceptance of what happened, acceptance of what would never be acknowledged, acceptance of the limits of the family's capacity for honesty. This acceptance was not peaceful or satisfying, but it was honest. It allowed people to stop waiting for an apology that would never come. It allowed them to grieve not only what happened, but what could have happened if truth had been possible. This distinction is crucial. Forgiveness is often portrayed as the only path forward, but it is not the only form of resolution. Sometimes the most healing act is naming reality and adjusting accordingly. That might mean redefining relationships, creating distance, setting boundaries, letting go of expectations that keep you trapped in disappointment. None of these actions look like closure from the outside, but they offer something closure cannot: agency. As this understanding spread quietly among some members of the family, a subtle shift occurred. The narrative began to fracture again, not loudly, not publicly, but internally. People stopped chasing reconciliation at any cost. They stopped performing forgiveness for the sake of appearances. They acknowledged, often privately, that the ending everyone wanted was not possible, and in doing so, they found a strange kind of relief. This relief did not come from resolution, but from alignment, from no longer forcing themselves into emotional positions that felt false, from no longer measuring their healing against an external standard that did not fit their experience. They learned that it was possible to live without closure, that life could continue without a neat ending. That meaning could exist alongside unresolved pain. The lie of closure had kept the family stuck in a loop of expectation and disappointment. Once that lie was exposed, the question changed. It was no longer, how do we forgive and move on, but how do we live honestly with what is? That question did not offer easy answers. It demanded courage. It demanded the willingness to accept loss, not just of peace, but of illusions. In rejecting false closure, the family faced its most difficult truth yet. Some choices are permanent. Some silences cannot be undone. Some relationships will never return to what they once were. This realization was not liberating in the way forgiveness is often promised to be. It was sobering, grounding, real, and it prepared the way for the final reckoning. Because when closure is no longer the goal, another question emerges. If forgiveness was never the ending, what was the family actually choosing all along? What did loyalty mean when stripped of illusion? And what does it cost to live with a choice that cannot be reversed? Those questions lead directly into the final chapter of this story. By the time the family reached this final stage, the decision had already been made. Not in a single moment, not by a single person, but through years of small cumulative choices. Loyalty had been chosen over truth. Silence over confrontation, survival over healing. And once those choices hardened into identity, there was no clean way back. Loyalty was no longer just a value, it was written into behavior, into memory, into blood. What people often misunderstand about loyalty is that it does not remain neutral. Once activated as a defense mechanism, it demands constant reinforcement. It reshapes moral boundaries. It teaches people what to justify, what to excuse, and what to forget. In our family, loyalty eventually stopped asking who was right and focused entirely on who was protected, and protection, once given, became irreversible. There were moments when change still seemed possible, brief windows when someone almost spoke, almost acknowledged what had been buried. These moments were fragile and terrifying. They carried the risk of collapse, and each time the family chose containment instead. The message was implicit but unmistakable. Opening this door would destroy too much. Better to live with the wound than to face the consequences of treating it. This is where loyalty becomes tragic rather than noble, because the people being protected are not the only ones affected. Loyalty draws a circle, and anyone outside that circle becomes expendable. Emotional distance becomes justified. Estrangement becomes normalized. Pain becomes collateral damage in the name of unity. The family did not see itself as cruel. It saw itself as necessary, as realistic, as doing what had to be done. Those who could not accept this reality eventually faced a choice of their own: stay and accept the terms, or leave and carry the weight alone. Neither option was clean. Staying meant ongoing self-betrayal, a quiet erosion of integrity. Leaving meant loss of connection, of shared history, of belonging. There was no victory here, only consequence. For those who left, the separation was not dramatic. It rarely is. It happened through distance, through fewer visits, through conversations that never went deep enough to justify the effort. The family adjusted. It always does. Absence was explained away, rationalized, turned into another story that did not need to be examined too closely. Loyalty absorbs loss and keeps going. For those who stayed, the cost was internal. They learned to compartmentalize, to live double lives emotionally, to present one version of themselves inside the family and another outside it. Over time, this division became exhausting. The self they protected at home grew smaller, quieter, less demanding. The self they expressed elsewhere carried anger, grief, and questions that had nowhere to go. What made this stage irreversible was not the original harm, but the accumulation of decisions afterward. Each time silence was chosen, it reinforced the system. Each time loyalty was rewarded, it strengthened the pattern. Eventually, the family could no longer imagine itself without these structures. They were no longer responses to trauma. They were tradition. This is why forgiveness at this stage was no longer even relevant. The story had moved beyond it. Forgiveness would not dismantle what had been built. It would not restore trust. It would not undo years of emotional conditioning. The choice had already been made, and it had reshaped everyone involved. Loyalty was no longer a reaction. It was the foundation. There is a particular grief that comes with recognizing this. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of inevitability. The understanding that some outcomes were locked in long before anyone realized what was happening. That the family did not suddenly become what it was. It arrived there step by step, choice by choice, silence by silence. This grief does not ask to be fixed, it asks to be acknowledged. In this final reckoning, clarity replaces hope, not the clarity of resolution, but the clarity of acceptance. The family sees itself honestly, perhaps for the first time. It sees the cost of its loyalty, the people it lost, the parts of itself it sacrificed. This clarity does not demand forgiveness, it demands responsibility for the future, if not the past. Some members choose to break the pattern for the next generation. They speak more openly with their children. They allow questions. They tolerate discomfort. They refuse to confuse love with silence. This does not undo what was done, but it changes what will be passed down. It is a quiet rebellion, one that does not seek permission. Others remain where they are, committed to the structure that kept them safe. This is not villainy. It is survival shaped by fear. Understanding this does not excuse the harm, but it explains its persistence. Families rarely choose cruelty outright. They choose familiarity. They choose what they know how to survive. In the end, the story does not resolve with reconciliation or absolution. It resolves with truth, a truth that is uncomfortable, incomplete, and deeply human. Loyalty was written in blood not because it was dramatic, but because it was inherited, defended, and normalized. It became part of the family's identity, inseparable from its history. The question is no longer why the family did not forgive. That question belongs to the past. The real question is what each person does with the understanding they now carry. Whether they repeat the pattern or interrupt it. Whether they confuse endurance with love or learn to tell the difference. Some stories do not end with healing, they end with recognition, and sometimes recognition is the most honest ending.